président de ce groupe de réflexion sur le Moyen-Orient. C'est un grand plaisir de vous accueillir et vous souhaiter la bienvenue à la 4e événement de notre programme pour cette année. It's a distinct honor once again for me to welcome our speaker, His Excellency Jon Allen, whom most of you know, and even people in Europe and the Middle East are familiar with the name, and also the time that he was serving in Middle East as well as in Europe as Canada's ambassador. Jon is a senior fellow at the Munk Center at the University of Toronto, as well as a senior fellow at the Canadian International Council. And during his service for the Government of Canada, he also held senior executive positions within the Department of Foreign Affairs. The details about the biography of His Excellency Jon Allen was provided. So in the interest of time, I would like to pass on the microphone to Jon, who is going to provide us with an overview regarding the state of affairs in the Middle East, and then we will move to the questions and answers. Mr. Ambassador, microphone is yours.
Hamid, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to the Middle East Study Group and to the CIC more generally. There is much happening in the region, both in terms of elections and new relationships. It'll be interesting to see whether these events result in real change and some hope in the future, or whether we end up with more of the same or even worse. Speaking of change, if you're interested in my take on the challenges the Biden administration is facing in trying to reintegrate the US into the liberal international order and on recent events in Washington, I posted a link in the chat to a piece that I recently did that's on the CIC's Signal board. So let's begin. We will get to the elections in Israel, I promise, but let's begin briefly with COVID, which is the other issue that's on everyone's mind, and where Israel, like the US, the UK, and the UAE for that matter, all started out terribly with amongst the highest cases and death tolls per capita in the world, and then went to the head of class with their much praised vaccination campaigns. So why was Israel so successful? I want to talk about it because there are some lessons that can be learned, some that can be learned and some that are unique to Israel. First of all, the country has a system of HMOs that all Israelis must register with. And they have local HMO clinics dotted all over the country. It also has a digitalized healthcare system, something that Canada seriously lacks. And Bibi promised to use that system to transfer all of Israel's COVID data to Pfizer as an incentive to obtain their vaccines. In fact, the head of Pfizer said that Bibi must have called him 3 or 4 times, pressuring him on this exact point. Well, it worked. Bibi was also able to use the Holocaust card, as the CEO of Pfizer's parents were Holocaust survivors. And finally, I think he also paid a pretty significant premium. On the Palestinian side, however, only approximately 1% of the population has been vaccinated to date, with vaccines supplied largely by the UAE. Luckily, the population, especially in Gaza, where crowding, a lack of proper drinking water, and sanitation are major issues, the population is relatively young, and early predictions of a pandemic disaster have thankfully not yet panned out. Israel, as you may have read, has largely refused to supply the West Bank and Gaza with vaccines, claiming the PAA was responsible for health under the Oslo Accords. Others have argued that as an occupier, Israel has an obligation to act. Meanwhile, Israel has shipped vaccines to Guatemala, to Hungary, and elsewhere. They have now started to vaccinate the approximately 120,000 Palestinian workers who come into Israel on a daily basis. Bottom line, this was a moral and a PR disaster for Israel, in my view. Israel's COVID experience also served to widen the split in that country between the secular and the Orthodox. The latter, who now make up approximately 11% of the population and are growing, wouldn't follow the rules and Bibi wouldn't enforce them. So in the middle of the crisis, schools and businesses stayed open in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, but not in Tel Aviv. This only adds to polarization caused by massive subsidies that the ultra-Orthodox receive, in part as payment for voting consistently for Likud or their partners, and for their refusal to join the military or do social service. In the broader region, COVID has hit Iran particularly hard, and the Trump sanctions and economic crisis that they provoked have only exacerbated the situation there. Now a brief update on the Abraham Accords, Jared Kushner's gift to Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. The Palestinians, as you know, initially described it as a stab in the back, as the Accords had dropped the land for peace precondition of the Saudi peace initiative and had replaced it with a promise to postpone annexation on the Israeli side in return for full recognition by these countries. The Palestinians had little choice but to back away from their full-on opposition to the Accords, as they received virtually no support from the Arab world for their cause. This phenomenon, if it persists, is a much bigger problem that bodes ill for the Palestinians' pursuit of a two-state solution. Others, however, suggest that the Accords could pave the way for a united effort by the Gulf, Egypt, Jordan, and the US to pressure Israel to moderate. I personally remain skeptical, but would love to see it happen. Netanyahu ruffled more than a few feathers in the UAE last week when he tried to arrange a last-minute visit there in an effort to boost his election prospects. In the end, and after further straining relations with Jordan, the visit didn't happen. Finally, on this, and despite COVID, over 130,000 Israelis, tourists and businessmen and women, have already visited the Gulf since the accord was signed just a few months ago. Now a brief word about the Biden election and its impact on the region. In polling done last year, Israel and Russia were the only two countries whose populations supported Trump over Biden. In Russia's case, the Russians love a strong man, and as we know, Trump refused to criticize Putin despite piles of evidence of Russian interference in the 2016 election and of hacking into the US government and business. For Israel, Trump, Kushner, and their ambassador, David Friedman, represented the most pro-Israel, pro-settlement, and anti-Palestinian administration in US history. While Trump's first visits abroad were to Saudi Arabia and Israel, Biden waited 4 weeks to call both Bibi and the Saudi king. This created a mini crisis in Jerusalem. Why did he wait so long? First, the Middle East, save for Iran, is not top of the US agenda. COVID, national unity, the economy, climate, China, Russia are all higher priorities. Note, for example, that Secretary of State Tony Blinken made his first trip abroad to Asia. Second, it was a signal to MBS, the Crown Prince, regarding the brutal murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the kingdom's generally awful human rights record. As for Bibi, it may have been partial payback. You may recall that he snubbed Biden by announcing a plan to build 1,600 new homes in occupied East Jerusalem in the middle of an official Biden visit to Israel as vice president. And then, of course, there was Bibi's speech to Congress to oppose the Iran deal during the Obama administration. He came only invited by the Republican leaders of the House and the Senate, and Obama refused to see him. Speaking of Iran, it and the JCPOA, or the Iran deal, are back on the table, or almost back on the table. Biden and his team, many of whom negotiated the original agreement, including Wendy Sherman, Bill Burns, and Rod Malley, want to get back to the status quo ante and then begin to work on ballistic missiles and Iranian support for terrorism. The Israelis, the Saudis, many Republicans in Congress, and some Democrats oppose this action. There is, unfortunately, a very short window to make it happen, as the Iranians are holding elections this summer, and it's very possible that a more conservative anti-JCPOA agreement government will take over. That would be bad for non-proliferation more generally, and bad for the region on multiple fronts. The Biden administration has also signaled a desire to return to traditional American policy vis-a-vis the two-state solution and the position that settlements are illegal and should be stopped. It is moving slowly to restore relations with the Palestinians. It hasn't happened yet, but they're talking of reopening the consulate in Jerusalem and the Palestinian office in Washington. But it's restricted in part by legislation that Trump passed, and it wants to see movement on elections and on the payments to martyrs' families. My bottom line here is that unless the US ultimately decides to put real pressure on Israel, a la Bush 41 and Jim Baker with Begin, de facto annexation is going to continue. Now turning to the elections in both Israel and the territories. Yes, these were the fourth in 2 years in Israel, and some are suggesting that there could well be a fifth. It's still too early to call in terms of building a coalition, and the efforts to try to build a coalition by both the pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi side will take weeks, if not months, as it did the last election. On the elections, we should be clear about one thing. They did not have to happen, and they took place for one reason and for one reason only, because Netanyahu is doing everything possible not to go to trial, not to be indicted, and not to go to jail. He hoped that if he could win this election and remain as PM, he could ensure that the Knesset would pass legislation granting him immunity. That is not at all clear. And in fact, Likud under Bibi has lost votes in each of the 4 elections. He started out in the high 30s and is now down to about 30 Knesset seats. The election campaigns in Israel were not about Iran, they were not about the Palestinians, they were not about the US or the Abraham Accords. They were all about Bibi, pro or con, and his management of COVID and the economy. And in fact, in the end, it seemed that both COVID and the economy played a smaller role, and it was really pro-Bibi, anti-Bibi, with a couple of parties on the extremes, an Islamist party called RAM, which broke away from the Joint Arab List on the one hand, and a fascist party, religious Zionism on the right, which Bibi encouraged to group together in order to run and surpass the 3.5% threshold. On election night, I thought I was reliving the US election all over again. I went to bed thinking, as the exit polls suggested, that a Bibi victory was in the cards. Now that most of the votes are in, it seems like a fifth election, as I said, is the likeliest possibility. Bibi's path to 61 seats is complicated. Unless he can win over some defectors, which happened last time, but may well be more difficult this time, He would be looking for defectors from either Naftali Bennett's party, Yamina, from Gideon Saar's party, New Hope, or from Benny Gantz, who had actually been predicted perhaps not even to get into the Knesset, but his party did slightly better than expected. Or, as I said, Bibi is actually trying to attract the Islamist Arab Party of Mansour Abbas to join him. And that will be quite a trick given the anti-Arab policies of most of the other parties in his coalition possibilities. The path of the anti-Bibi parties, led by Yair Lapid, the head of Yesh Atid, will also depend in part on whether the joint Arab list and that same Islamist party are prepared to support them. Labor, the grand old party of Israel, now led by Merav Michaeli, the only woman to lead a party in this election, was actually resuscitated and will end up with 7 or 8 seats. Meretz, another left party that was in danger of not passing the threshold, ultimately did. The most disheartening news of the election, as I mentioned, was that a radical far-right party made up of an anti-Arab party, an anti-LGBTQ party, and fascists of the Kahane party of old won 6 seats and will sit in the Knesset. Hopefully, they won't be part of any coalition. If Bibi does somehow again pull the rabbit out of the hat and holds on to power, it will be bad for the rule of law and liberal democracy in Israel. It will be bad for those who seek a just agreement with the Palestinians, and it could send the signal that racism, homophobia, and threats to the independence of the judiciary are to be tolerated and in some cases encouraged. But as a webinar that I was listening to earlier today suggested, even if the anti-Bibi group gets in, the anti-Bibi group and Israelis more generally, not Labor and not Meretz and not the joint list, but Israelis generally are not focusing on the Palestinian issue at this time. And probably whoever gets in, that won't be an initial or even a medium-term focus of any government coming forward. The evidentiary phase of Bibi's trial, by the way, begins in 2 weeks. The Palestinians have also decided, after 15 years, to hold their own elections. Parliamentary elections are slated for May 22 and presidential elections in July. There are also supposed to be elections for the PLO's governing body. The PLO purportedly represents all Palestinians, both within Palestine and the diaspora. That's about 13 million Palestinians worldwide. According to the polling, 75% of Palestinians say they want elections. One must assume that what a good percentage of those also want is change. It's not clear, however, at this time, whether they will get either the elections or change. Analysts, including many Palestinians, are already questioning whether the elections will take place. COVID, Israeli obstructionism, the impact of Hamas's participation. They're also questioning whether they will be free and fair, and whether they will bring about real change and new blood, or whether they will merely reaffirm the old guard. Other questions: will the US and Israel allow a parliament and or a government that includes Hamas representatives? And will Hamas bow to pressure from Egypt and Qatar to moderate itself before the elections? The current election rules prohibit anyone younger than 28 and any civil servants from joining a list, which seems very strange to me. While most believe there will only be 2 lists in the end, one led by Mahmoud Abbas, 84 years old now, and the other by Yahya al-Sinwar, Hamas's current leader in Gaza. However, other names and other possible lists continue to be mentioned. The most promising alternative candidate would, in my mind, be the former finance and prime minister, Salam Fayyad. He was smart, he was incorruptible, and he was forced out precisely because he was trying to bring about fundamental change to the way things were being done in the PA. For those reasons, his candidacy is unlikely to see the light of day. Other possible names include Marwan Barghouti, perhaps the most popular candidate, who's serving a life sentence in an Israeli jail, and Mohammed Dahlan, a sworn enemy of Abbas, now living in the UAE. If the elections do take place and the old guard is merely confirmed, the results may simply breed more cynicism and further harm the credibility of Palestinian leadership, both within the territories and abroad. So let me stop there and let's move to questions. That's always the most interesting part. And I'm happy to hear from all of you.
Thank you very much, John. It was a very broad overview that you provided, and you covered almost everything that we hear or we read about the region at this time. There are many participants, and I'm sure there will be many questions. And for that reason, I'm only going to make two observations and ask your opinion about that. In the past, when the Mizrahin and Middle East Jews were somewhat the majority in Israel, there was more reconciliatory sort of a approach to problem solving or conflict resolution. But with the arrival of the almost over 1 million refuseniks, do you think that has to do something with the aggressive posturing that we see today?
Well, I'll just correct one thing. The Ashkenazim, the European Jews, were the original. I mean, we're not talking about the original in the early 1900s, but post-war, it was the Ashkenazim, the German Jews, the Polish Jews that formed the majority coming out of Europe. As you imply, perhaps more open to conversations, to negotiations, etc. Then you had the influx of the Mizrahim or the Sephardim. These are the Jews that came out of northern Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Iraq, etc. They were essentially thrown out of those countries, and they were more conservative. And then, as you correctly mentioned, over 1 million Russians came, and they were also very conservative, anti-religious, but also quite anti-Arab. And so you have seen a change in the mix. The other factor that was mentioned earlier today and is constantly mentioned was the Second Intifada as a factor in sending many, many Israelis who used to identify on the left with labor, with Meretz, sent them into the middle. And that's where they still sit. They used to joke when I was in Israel that there's no left. Labor did make a bit of a comeback and Meretz did get over the threshold, but it is certainly a minority. And the only way that it will have influence is if it can be a part of that anti-Bibi bloc that's trying to get into the Knesset.
Okay, thank you. There are many questions and the questions go up and down. It's hard to control, but could you talk about the implications for Israel of current developments in Lebanon and Syria?
Well, the situation in Syria vis-a-vis Israel is of concern to the extent that Iran is supporting those in Syria, some Iranians and Syrians, who are causing Israel problems along the border, but not insurmountable problems. Israel has been able to fight back on a regular basis. There has been talk of activity on the part of Hezbollah in Lebanon as of late. There was a rush of news about activity on the border. That has since died down. I would tend to imagine that Lebanon's got plenty of its own problems at this point, and getting involved in any activity with Israel would not be in their interests. I did note today earlier that Iran allegedly attacked an Israeli commercial ship. That is disturbing news. And of course, it follows the assassination of the Iranian general and the Iranian scientist, which no doubt were alleged to have been caused by Israel. So we're getting a bit of tit for tat. I would argue that that's very unfortunate as the Biden administration tries to move the ball forward on the JCPOA. This is only going to create problems with the GOP in Washington, and of course with Israel and the Saudis.
One more comment here or question is regarding JCPO that you mentioned. What is the reason for opposing it? Is it because the unity that was displayed with P5+1, or is it really has to do with disarmament and non-proliferation?
The reason for opposing the agreement?
No, for the success of the JCPOA to begin with, it was a display of unity amongst P5+1. Yes. And there is a speculation that perhaps that was the reason why Bibi was so opposed, because was afraid that the next thing the unity is going to present would be something about the settlements or similar issues and disarmament. Is it a fair assumption?
I mean, to my mind, Bibi opposed the JCPOA for a number of reasons. And before I get into them, I'll just say that there is good evidence to the effect that the IDF and Mossad at the time of the negotiation of the agreement were actually in favor of it. They didn't think it was perfect. In fact, the P5+1 didn't think it was perfect, but they thought it was better than not having an agreement. Bibi opposes it because Bibi was not convinced that it was going to be a long-term enough break on the Iranians, which is what he said. He further opposed it because he said, you're only dealing with the nuclear side, and you're not dealing with support for terrorism, and you're not dealing with the ballistic missile threat, which is a potential threat to us if it ended up in the region beyond Iran. So he based his criticism on that. I think it was wrong, and I think the whole Trump fiasco of getting out of the agreement and then imposing sanctions, and now having the Iranians move forward with their nuclear program, has only proven that it was a good deal at the time, because the IAEA was supportive. To get the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, and the others on board together was quite a coup, and trying to do that now is, as you can imagine, not going to be so easy.
Thank you. You have answered some of the questions I see repeated and related to what you said about the current conflict, naval conflict. You have answered that. And then there is a question about the election. Is there any prospect of raising the 3.5% bar for the representation in the Knesset in order to make it more difficult for fringe parties to gain seats and ideally facilitate governing coalition formation?
Well, the bar was actually lower before than it is. 19 parties started out running, 14 ended up in the election as 5 dropped out. I remember being in the foreign ministry and having the head of policy planning tell me that actually this multiplicity of parties was a good thing because it reflected the multicultural and multi-religious nature of the country. And it gave all of these, it gave the Mizrahis, and it gave the Ashkenazi Orthodox, and it gave the left, and it gave the Joint Arab List. It gave all these people an opportunity to vote. But clearly there's a major problem. There's a major problem with the number of parties. There's also a major problem with Bibi, because I think most people agree, whether they're on the right or the left, that if Bibi wasn't there, the right probably would have won the last and this election. Because if you take a look at what happened, you had a chunk of Likud, Bibi's party, leave with Gidon Sar, and you had a chunk of Likud leave with Naftali Bennett. And if Bibi hadn't been there, they would have stayed, and you would have had 75 seats on the right, probably. I have not heard that they are contemplating raising the 3.5%. And that doesn't seem to come up in the conversations about the difficulties of putting a coalition together. It's more the blocks and the infighting.
There is one question, and that's pertaining to the nature of Hamas. And it goes, Hamas cannot align itself with any liberal school of thought, and let alone a process of democracy. Islam and the liberalism do not meet even in eternity. The battle between Islam and liberalism has been going on for 150 years without success or even progress. Where do you see a meeting point, if any?
Well, first of all, I'm no expert in Islam. And I'm frankly no expert in Hamas. I was the ambassador in Israel, and we have a representative in the Palestinian territories. But I would point to the fact that people change, parties change, views change. And all you have to do is look at Mansour Abbas, who's the head of the Islamist party, was part of the joint list. He's Palestinian Israeli, he's religious, and he attracted enough votes to get 6 seats. And he is talking to both Bibi Netanyahu and to Yair Lapid right now in order to try and decide what he is going to do. Yasser Arafat moved from being what the world called a terrorist to shaking hands with Yitzhak Rabin at the White House and recognizing Israel. I think if you looked strictly at what maybe certain Islamist texts or Islamic texts have to say, maybe you could come to the conclusion that the questioner arrived at, but politics is politics, and peace and conflict or peace and conflict, and I would hope we could get past that. On the other side, you've got Israelis who claim that they're entitled to the land from the Jordan to the sea because they occupied it 3,000 years ago. So you've got both sides using religion to serve their ends, and neither of which are particularly helpful in trying to solve the conflict.
Thank you. There are two questions, not related, but I will read them. Can you comment on the possible ICC investigation? Did it factor in the election at all? And are there any elements in Israel and in West Bank, Gaza, that are supportive of that? And then the second question was, what do you envision will be the ultimate outcome of Bibi's legal challenges, and when do you feel that finally it will arrive?
Thanks. On the ICC, I don't think it frankly had much of an impact on the elections, because I think probably 95% of Israelis oppose the actions by the ICC. I'm sure B'Tselem and some human rights groups support the fact that there is going to be an investigation, especially both on the question of what happened in the war in Gaza and what is currently happening vis-a-vis the occupation in the West Bank. But I don't think it had an impact on the elections at all. I am personally of the view that this is something, let me put it to you this way. I disagree with Bibi's view that this is all about anti-Semitism. Whether it's, quote, political or not, I think there is probably an element of politics here. There's an element of politics in many of the ICC's decisions, certainly in deciding not to go after the P5. There's politics in that. But I think what should happen is that it should play out, and there should be an investigation. And if Israel is correct, then they will either win on the jurisdiction side, or they'll win on the facts. And if they're wrong, then they won't. You will perhaps know that even though they're not parties, jurisdiction can be had by the ICC if the country in question is either unable or unwilling to prosecute. And there's an argument, for example, that in the West Bank, violence against Palestinians have not been prosecuted by the Israeli military to the extent that they should have. There have been very, very few convictions, few prosecutions, and so there's an argument there. But it's certainly, there's no argument within Israel except amongst a very small group. On the legal challenge, Bibi, on Bibi. Well, he's up on 3 charges. As I said, the evidentiary part of the trial begins in a couple of weeks. That could be potentially embarrassing, because there's a number of people that worked with Bibi that have testified against him. It will undoubtedly take time, because you're going to have the evidentiary side, you'll have a decision, you'll have an appeal, and the only thing interesting that could happen, if the anti-Bibi group somehow can put together a coalition of 61 or 60 and have people from the outside support, they will be able in the Knesset to appoint a speaker. The final results of the election in terms of who's going to be a prime minister can happen after the Knesset sits. So the seats have been decided, the Knesset sits, and if 60 or more, 61 or more, but some on the outside, agree, they will appoint a speaker of the Knesset who is anti-Bibi, who could then introduce and get legislation passed that would prevent Bibi from serving because he is indicted and about to go to trial. So that's one element of the trial that is kind of up for grabs right now. Otherwise, if that doesn't happen, then of course, the other side of the coin is if Bibi can convince people to come to his side, he will make every effort to get a law passed to give him immunity. The so-called French law that prevents a French president from being tried and convicted while he's in office. So we'll see what happens.
A questioner, Actually, one of the participants have expressed thanks to you for an excellent analysis. And the question is, um, are the parties aware, and that's reference to the Arab community, of the advantages of cooperation over conflict? And that could include the Arab countries that have a stake, especially Jordan, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, etc.
I'm not quite understanding. Are they aware? I mean,
Where are the elements of Israeli and Palestinian society that could find common ground? What issues could build awareness of the advantages of cooperation over conflict? That could include all the Arab states in the region, in the MENA region.
yeah. Well, I have said this for a long time. There's a real problem in Israel right now over the conflict and over this question of where can you find common ground? The problem in Israel right now is no one is looking for common ground because Israelis, except for some IDF soldiers at the checkpoints, do not see Palestinians, the vast majority. They do not visit the West Bank except for the settlers. They have relatively good lives, despite the fact that they've had 4 elections and a bit of a rough COVID. But generally speaking, there are no consequences right now for Israel for not moving forward. So that's a problem. If there's no consequences, then there's no pressure. What I don't understand is if anybody's looking 5 or 10 years into the future, what do they see as ultimately happening? Are they going to, is Israel going to continue to occupy Gaza, the West Bank? Are they going to do that even after perhaps the population of Palestinian Israelis and Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza are larger than the Jewish population? In other words, are they going to continue towards an apartheid state where a minority of Jews in Israel are going to control a group of people into eternity? Will there be violence? Will there be finally pressure from the outside, as there was in South Africa? I don't know. What's happening now, instead of pressure, you've got the Gulf states recognizing Israel. They have agreements with Jordan and Egypt, but now that they actually have more friendly agreements, they didn't come out of conflict, of course, but more friendly agreements with Morocco, Bahrain, UAE, and Sudan than they did with the others. So there's no incentive on the part of Israelis to either find out what's really going on in the territories, or unless they get a leader who understands what the problem going forward is and leads them to that, makes them realize that getting this Palestinian question off their back, not spending billions of dollars on settlements, on protecting settlements, building them and protecting them, not spending billions of dollars on security, but allowing the Palestinians to have their own state and simply moving on. I don't understand why they don't get it, but they don't, and therefore this question of common ground, I don't see it developing right now. I see it only developing when the Bibis and the Mahmoud Abbases of the world have gone. You have young leadership who are forward-looking and want a different future in that region.
Thank you. There is a question from one of the senior journalists, and that is, I will read that for you. Thanks for a wonderfully informative discussion. Is the two-state solution effectively dead?
No, the two-state solution is not dead. It's not dead, and some of you have probably heard me say this before, but I'm going to say it again. The Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland were fighting for 400 years. In the middle of the Troubles, nobody would have believed that it was going to end. I spoke to a journalist, a South African, who had moved to Israel. He had been forced to leave South Africa because he was a liberal. And he said to me, when I left, I thought apartheid was going to last for 50 more years. And I sat around the executive table. I wasn't a senior executive then, but I happened to be at the table when there was reporting on what was going on in Moscow in 1989. Nobody in the West had a clue that the wall was going to fall. This is not an insoluble problem. The issues have been known since the Clinton parameters, since Rabin and Arafat, since Oslo. We know what the 5 final status issues are. With compromise, they can be reached. And Aaron David Miller, who advised 4 different presidents, said it takes leadership, it takes ownership on both sides. You'll recall that the Israelis and the Palestinians did Oslo together with the Norwegians, but essentially together. The Jordanians and the Israelis did that agreement by themselves, and the Egyptians and the Israelis did that agreement by themselves. So they need ownership, both sides. But finally, my view, and I differ a little bit, is that they also need US pressure. And as I suggested, Baker and Bush put pressure on Israel, and Israel moved. And it's not going to move unless there is some pressure. And if there isn't pressure, then de facto annexation is going to continue. And then, you know, I understand where the question's coming from, because you could argue that there has been so much settlement building now that it's going to be problematic to withdraw some of those settlers. But I still think it's doable. And I think the 2-state solution is doable. And I think the alternative is unacceptable. And I'm not a believer in the 1-state solution.
Thank you. There is a question regarding the Saudis. Is there still a Saudi interest in Israeli-Palestinian settlement? What role might they be expected to play in this process?
Well, the Saudis must have given the okay to the UAE and Bahrain for the Abraham Accords. They, of course, have decided not to participate at this point. The press suggests it's the Saudi king, that if it had been up to MBS, they might have. There is some pride, I would imagine, in the Saudi peace initiative, which, as I mentioned, took the position that there would be no recognition until there was peace between Israel and Palestine. I wish that the Saudis would put some pressure on their Gulf buddies and try and put pressure on Israel. Essentially, you got a postponement of annexation in exchange for recognition, and not much more than that. So whether the Saudis will want to get involved, whether they want to put pressure on Israel, I don't know. Clearly, the Saudis are happy about the fact that Israel will be cooperating with Bahrain, with them, and with UAE on its positions vis-a-vis Iran. There will be lots of intelligence shared. There will be military sales. Strategic analysis will be shared. And so that, for the Saudis and the Gulfies and Israel, is kind of the cherry on top, cooperation against the threat that they see from Iran.
Thanks. There is a question about the JCPOA, and the question is, was the JCPOA successful, and how reliable are the IAEA reports and checkups?
You know, this is really quite complicated. I know people who will read me a list of 100 reasons why the JCPOA was a bad deal and why the IAE couldn't do all of the inspections that were required and how the Iranians had breached the agreement. That's not my understanding of it. And the IAE the IAE is supportive of the agreement. 6 countries were supportive of the agreement. There was no indication before Trump was elected of a significant breach of the agreement. There was nobody saying that the Iranians had breached and therefore the Americans were entitled. And in fact, Trump wasn't saying it at the beginning either. He campaigned before he was elected on getting out of the Iran agreement. Now, again, I'm not an expert, and there probably are experts, but I don't believe in conspiracy theories on this. And if Germany and the P5 got together and were satisfied, along with the IEA, that this was an agreement that was going to slow and hopefully lead to stopping the Iranians from moving forward, then I'm going to go along with it. And as I said before, what we saw in Trump's getting out of the agreement and imposing sanctions has been nothing but a disaster for the Iranian people, a disaster for the economy. But now the Iranians aren't blaming the Iranian administration, the Iranian government. They're blaming Trump for their economic woes because he's the one that's imposed sanctions. So the idea that you were going to force some major change in Iran and overturn the government has proven itself, as many people told the Trump administration, completely incorrect. It's not going to happen.
Thank you, John. We have only a few minutes and there are many questions. I'll try to bunch them together. And again, we have to be cognizant of the fact that time is, we have only a few minutes. You said that Biden, US should put pressure, and the question is, can Biden put pressure on US, or how should he? And then about Canada's position, where does Canada stand for all of this? There is also a question about the role of Turkey, and also a question about the negotiations with respect to oil and gas in the sea, and also the possibility of a new conflict with Hezbollah. So these are the key questions. Would you be kind enough to address them in a short time that we have?
So, I mean, on Biden, I said he simply doesn't have the bandwidth right now to be focused on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And frankly, with elections in both places and the instability domestically, there's no point in even thinking about it until things have settled down. So, you know, we're at least 6 months, a year before I think they're going to turn their attention to that. They hopefully will turn their attention to opening up the consulate and the office in Washington and start flowing some money both to UNRWA and they never flow to the PA itself, but to projects in the territories. In terms of Turkey, I mean, Erdogan's another Trump. He is so completely unpredictable now. You know, from buying the Russian missiles and being a member of NATO to most recently getting rid of as the governor of the Bank of Turkey in the midst of economic crisis. To I mean, it's having the government leave the Istanbul Agreement on the rights of women. I mean, you really can't predict what's going on. When I served in Israel, there were 3 countries that were at the top of the list in terms of Israeli diplomatic protocol. And both the president and the prime minister would show up at their national days. This was how you could tell who was important, because both of them would show up. And it was the Americans, the Egyptians, and the Turks. The relationship between Israel and Turkey at that time in 2006, 2007 was right at the top. There was trade, there was security cooperation, there was intelligence cooperation. And then the Gaza incident happened. Things went bad between them. And things went bad between them. But since then, frankly, Erdogan's gone off the rails, whether it's in Syria or the other issues I mentioned. There is still, surprisingly, cooperation between Turkey and Israel. Israel never misses a beat. I mean, where their interests are favor cooperation, they cooperate, even as they did with the Saudis and the UAE long before there was recognition, there was cooperation. So there's stuff going on, but it's I just find Turkey a complete wild card in the region now, unpredictable. Miss one?
There is one question that is, you could probably close with that question, is that, however, young people are moving farther apart in both Israel and Palestine. It seems that either time is of the essence or the education of young people has to change.
You're absolutely right. The numbers in Palestine seem to be suggesting a group favoring the one-state solution over the two-state solution. I don't think they exactly know what that means or where it gets them or what the long-term gain is on that, but that is the case. And my sense is that the young people who never knew Rabin, who never knew Oslo, who never had a sense that there could be an agreement between Israel and Palestine, the young people there are also pretty conservative. But once again, you need leadership. You need somebody that is prepared to stand up and bring people along, as opposed to leadership that instills fear and is at times racist and has no interest, as Bibi has had no interest in a solution.
Could Canada do anything in that sphere?
Canada. My position is that Canada, Europe, and the United States are in the same boat. If they truly believe in a true state solution, if they truly believe that settlements are illegal, if they understand that de facto annexation is going on now, then they have to step up. Will they? I doubt it. But should they? They absolutely should. And just like we see with the Chinese, if you group together and you take a strong position, a fair but strong position, then you can get some action, hopefully. And I'm talking about carrots and sticks here. It's not all sticks. It can be carrots and sticks with Israel. But if there's no consequences, we're not going to see any change because there's no interest in it.
Well, it was a very thorough analysis and the questions were very pertinent and you provided very good answers. And on the last note, it seems that with leadership, you talked about leadership of distinguished diplomats like yourself, and I know there are other groups here in Ottawa who are addressing these issues. I think we have part of that leadership right here, and we will be looking forward to new initiatives or new talks, and we will be, as a study group, we will be following you and others to communicate some of the findings or some of the ideas that you have with the members of the Canadian International Council. Thank you very much, Ambassador Allen.
Thank you.
For your insightful comments. And I would like to thank the participants who stayed with us. And those of you who are not members of the CIC, please consider becoming a member, because that helps us organize these events. And I also wanted to thank our communication director, Mr. Samuel Amoy, who has been doing multitasking. He's a graduate student, he's working full time, and he's also generously providing us with his technical support. So thank you to everybody, and especially to John. John?
Thank you so much. Thank you to the CIC. Stay healthy, everybody.
Thank you. The session ends at this time.